Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to trace the fascinating pipeline of economics. We'll be following the entire journey, right from our basic human desires all the way down to the creation of national wealth. But to really grasp how this engine works, we actually need to start with a very strange contradiction that totally puzzled early economists. Right, let's dive into this paradox of value. You see, water is absolutely essential for human survival, yet it costs almost nothing. Diamonds, on the other hand, are completely unnecessary for survival, yet they cost a fortune. So what's going on here? Well, it perfectly highlights how we humans assign value. We have value in use, which is the actual utility or survival value, and market value in exchange, which is driven by scarcity. Because water is incredibly plentiful, its market value stays low. But diamonds? They're scarce. So their exchange value skyrockets, completely regardless of the fact that you can't exactly drink a diamond to survive.
So let's start at the very beginning of the pipeline with wants, utility, and value.
The entire economic engine really begins with human psychology, specifically our unlimited recurring wants. To satisfy them, we consume goods and services, seeking something economists call utility. Utility is simply the want-satisfying power of a commodity. But here's the real kicker. It is entirely subjective. You can't measure it with a ruler, you can't weigh it on a scale. It resides entirely in the consumer's mind. A cup of coffee might have massive utility for you first thing in the morning, but absolutely zero utility for someone who hates caffeine.
Now let's look at the law of diminishing marginal utility, and we'll track this by imagining you're eating mangoes. As you eat that first mango, your marginal utility, the added satisfaction you get, is a high 10 utils. But by the time you're on your fourth mango, that added satisfaction drops to just 1. The fifth mango adds 0. And notice how consuming that sixth mango actually gives you negative utility, a -3. It provides disutility because, well, you're just way too full. This natural law dictates exactly how we pace our consumption.
Moving right along to our second section, production, income, and markets. To actually get the goods that give us utility, we move to production. This is the process of physically adding utility to an object. For example, a carpenter takes raw wood and creates form utility by turning it into a table. A trucking company creates place utility by moving that table to a store near you. But this production process requires 4 distinct factors, and they certainly don't work for free. Each one earns a specific type of factor income as a reward. Land, which includes all natural resources, earns rent. Labor, representing human effort, earns a wage. Capital, the man-made tools and machinery, earns interest. And the entrepreneur, the person organizing the whole operation and taking on the risk, earns profit. This is exactly how income flows right into the pockets of households.
And this brings us to where the magic happens. It's where buyers with their newly earned incomes and producers with their finished goods finally meet, the market. When the downward-sloping demand curve intersects the upward-sloping supply curve, that exact meeting point is the equilibrium price. It's the precise price where the quantity buyers demand perfectly equals the quantity sellers are supplying. It's the ultimate balancing point of the whole market.
Of course, to make these market exchanges smooth, we operate in a money economy rather than a barter economy. In a barter system, if you have wheat and you want rice, you have to find someone who has rice and specifically wants your wheat, a massive headache that economists call the double coincidence of wants. Money acts as a universally acceptable medium of exchange, completely eliminating this problem and greasing the wheels of the entire economy. Okay, time for section 3. We're calling this the leakage ledger, and we're going to be deconstructing saving. We've had a massive economic crossroads. What exactly happens to the money we don't spend? Well, we need a clean algebraic baseline for our leakage ledger, and that is saving. Saving is defined simply as that part of income which is not spent on consumption. The fundamental textbook identity is S equals Y minus C. Savings equals income minus consumption. It is the absolute bedrock equation for wealth building.
Now, we have to draw a hard line here between 2 incredibly similar words. Saving without an S at the end is an action. It's the current, ongoing act of non-consumption out of today's income. But savings with an S is a pool of wealth. It is the total accumulated value of all your past savings stacked up over time. Think of it as action versus accumulation.
You can visualize this leakage ledger as 4 distinct storage bands, or vaults, operating across different microsectors. First up, the personal saving vault. That's just unspent household income. Second, the business saving vault. These are corporate retained profits, held back as liquid reserves, or plowed back into the business for expansion instead of being paid out to shareholders. Third, government saving. This is state savings achieved through a budget surplus, which happens when government revenue exceeds public expenditure. And finally, aggregate saving, the megavault. This is the total saving done by all people in an economy, the sum total of private and government savings combined.
Section 4 takes us to investment and capital formation.
Here's the secret of economics. Those aggregate savings don't just sit idly in vaults collecting dust. If they do, the economy completely stalls out. Instead, they're transformed into investment through a vital three-step process called capital formation. Step 1 is the creation of the savings we just talked about. Step 2 is mobilization, transferring those parked funds through banks and financial markets to entrepreneurs who actually need them. And step 3 is the actual investment. This is when businesses use those funds to purchase producer goods like machinery, residential housing, or inventory stocks, which expands the economy's future production capacity. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 5, inflation and the business cycle. This continuous flow of income, saving, and investment doesn't happen in a vacuum. It operates within a macroeconomic environment that is constantly fluctuating. Sometimes this system overheats, leading to a persistent rise in the general price level, what we all know as inflation. This usually comes in two flavors. Demand pull inflation happens when buyers simply want too much. Aggregate demand exceeds the economy's aggregate supply. Cost push inflation, on the other hand, comes from the producer side when the rising costs of raw materials or labor push prices upward. These constant pressures of inflation, saving, and investment map out the business cycle. Economic activity is never just a straight, predictable line. It tracks reoccurring macroeconomic fluctuations. We ride up to the peaks of prosperity, eventually contract down into recessions, sometimes hit the severe trough of a depression, and eventually we climb back up through a period of recovery. To make sense of all this messy, fluctuating reality, economists carefully categorize their data into stock variables and flow variables. A flow variable has a time dimension. It's expressed per unit of time, like our continuous monthly income or our current saving rate. A stock variable, however, has no time dimension. It is a frozen snapshot taken at a specific point in time, like measuring your total accumulated wealth on January 1st. Bringing it all together in Section 6, wealth and economic welfare. Ultimately, this massive pipeline we've been tracing, from the birth of a human want through production, saving, and investment, exists for a singular purpose: to generate national wealth. But what exactly counts as wealth? Well, in economics, wealth represents a stock of assets that are a source of income. But an asset must check 4 specific boxes to make the cut. It must possess utility, meaning it gives satisfaction. It must have scarcity, meaning it's limited in supply. It needs transferability, so ownership can actually change hands. And it must have exchange value, meaning it commands a price in the open market. To measure how much wealth a nation is actually generating for its citizens, we look at per capita income. You simply take the total national income and divide it by the population. It's the traditional yardstick economists use to gauge a country's standard of living and its overall economic development. But listen, it's vital to remember that total social welfare isn't just about the money. Social welfare is essentially the sum total of human happiness, and it's split into 2 parts. Economic welfare is the part we can measure in money terms, like per capita income and consumption. But non-economic welfare is just as important, if not more so. It includes things we just can't monetize, like environmental quality, political stability, law and order, and personal freedom. Because let's face it, a high income means absolutely nothing if you can't breathe the air. And that highlights the critical need for sustainable consumption. As we loop all the way back to the start of our pipeline, satisfying those endless human wants, we have to consume goods and services in a way that meets our needs today without destroying the environment or draining the resources needed by future generations. Which leaves us with a final, rather provocative question to consider about the true purpose of this entire economic engine we've just explored. As our national wealth grows and our per capita income rises, are we truly increasing our overall social welfare, our actual happiness, our freedom, and our environment, or are we just mindlessly consuming more? I'll leave you to think about that one. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.